Hello guys, I think it's time to take a closer look at a specific ability of the main character, which allowed him from being called the world's weakest hunter to clear dungeons solo and become a key force on a national scale. I am of course talking about the class that the main character obtains after completing the system's quest, as from now on he gained abilities allowing him to build and manage his own army, meaning he was technically no longer forced to clear dungeons and level up alone, which by the way he admitted himself. However, at this point I am only warning you about spoilers from later parts of the plot regarding the soldiers that Sung acquires throughout the entire series, because in the narrative itself, the numbers quickly go from the initial 30 that the main character can extract from the Fallen into tens and hundreds of thousands, and ultimately this number reaches 10 million. Meanwhile, as a system player, he has further skills at his disposal along the way, enabling him to better manage his troops, patrol the area, or protect his loved ones. And his soldiers perform better the more mana Sung has, because over time the shadows require regeneration during battles, much like his other skills. But this is basically one of the few downsides, since the Shadow Army, just like its master, constantly develops by defeating subsequent monsters, which is presented based on the corresponding rank or later specific grades assigned to Sung's servants. Through this, it is also much easier to assess the power of the system user's most important soldiers, and these throughout the series, just like their grades, underwent changes, and some were only temporarily part of the Dark Army built from the Fallen. The Ant Queen definitely fits this description, being the boss of the S-rank dungeon that Korea failed to clear despite multiple attempts, which caused subsequent generations of ants to appear over time on Jeju Island, becoming better and more capable than those that ruled the island 4 years before the main events. And it was all due to the Queen, who constantly laid more eggs, creating new generations of her children and warriors. Meanwhile, the government, after giving up following the third failed mission, began to fear a situation where the ants would manage to cross over to another mainland. For this reason, 4 years after the dangerous insects queen appeared, the best guild from Japan joined the Korean hunters, and together they initially managed to regain the upper hand on the island, and the Korean group even managed to sever the head of the colony's mother. But that wasn't enough to reclaim the island, because to cope with hunger, the queen gave birth to the Ant King, later named Beru, who turned out to be the strongest insect on the island. Despite this, Sung turned the situation around, and after extracting the shadow of the Ant King, he did the same with the Queen, but Beru explained to his new master that the Queen was not suited for combat, and her main ability was the capacity for reproduction, which is simply impossible without a physical body. Therefore, Sung decides to cancel her shadow extraction, especially since otherwise he would have less control over the undead ants, and he didn't need another commander in his army anyway. Meanwhile, a bit earlier, the main character also extracted the shadow of an S-class hunter who was a healer and one of the Ant King's victims, but this time the system user did not try to add the hunter to his forces, but only wanted to use his powers to save his friend and future wife. Therefore, after the healing was finished, at the request of the healer's companion, he ended the extraction and allowed his soul to rest in peace. However, he did not want to allow the same for the dragon Kamish, whom he desperately wanted to enlist into the ranks of his army. After all, this magical beast was the boss of the first S-rank dungeons to appear on Earth, and as a result of the fight with this reptile, hundreds of S-class hunters lost their lives, so without a doubt he would have been a valuable asset for Sung. But unfortunately, because 8 years had already passed since Kamish's death, despite his wishes, he couldn't permanently join the Shadow Soldiers. But as part of his devotion, he shared a few pieces of important information with his temporary master about the rulers and the fact that he used to be a servant of the Monarch of Destruction. And if you want to know more about this topic, I invite you to my episode, Who is Antars?, which should be visible in the info card or description.
Furthermore, please write down what topics from this and other series you would like me to cover on the channel in the near future. Anyway, getting back to the topic, although the trio I just mentioned are the only ones worth a longer mention among the temporary servants, I'll just add that Sung replaced his shadows multiple times, but these were usually nameless and lacked characteristic traits, not to mention that cases of failed shadow extraction were also not lacking in the series. This was because it relied on mana, meaning the system user couldn't recruit spiritual beings or demons with corrupted mana, and the chances of a successful shadow extraction dropped when the target was too strong, which annoyed Sung when he failed to acquire the leader of the Ice Elves, or Kamish. Also, in the case of ordinary humans, the King of the Dead couldn't use them as his soldiers because they didn't possess mana, which of course did not apply to the Awakened and Hunters, as was evident when the King of the Dead brought back the Healer as a shadow, or even earlier when an A-class Hunter tried in a frenzy to take the protagonist's life. This, of course, ends with the death of the adventurer, who returns as part of the undead army under the name Iron, with a very useful ability to taunt his opponents, allowing him to draw attacks to himself, as long as he was stronger than his target, of course. Yet that's not the end, because he also contributed to defeating the leader of the Ice Elves, and was later able to defeat S-rank equivalent giants with a single blow, who, by the way, also joined Sung's army, being some of his strongest infantrymen, numbered from 1 to 28, and just like Iron, they reached the rank of Elite Knight, thus serving as an equivalent to average S-class hunters. This is also similar to Jima, who was slightly weaker than them. As a boss belonging to the Naga race, he fought using a trident and magic, and could also increase his size. Meanwhile, a rank lower, classified as a knight, is a bear named Tank, whom the main character acquires shortly before Iron, along with other ice bears during the Red Gate incident. True to his name, he plows through opponents like a tank, tearing them apart with his fangs and claws. While despite his animal instincts, he is obedient to his master, displaying a certain level of intelligence, thanks to which he was able to cooperate with Iron, for instance, during the clash with the High Orcs and Kargalgan. Before I move on to this powerful figure and the higher ranks among the undead soldiers, I must mention another knight rank Sado belonging to a wyvern named Kaisel by Sung, which is a bit of a distortion of the dragon's original name because Sung wasn't able to remember it correctly, which was also the case with his other servants for that matter. In any case, while Kaisel doesn't possess any special abilities, he sometimes serves as an alternative means of transportation for the system user, especially when he cannot use Shadow Exchange, through which he was able to teleport to the location of his servants once every 3 hours. But over time, as the main character developed as the Shadow Monarch, this ability not only lost its cooldown, but began to resemble pure teleportation, meaning he no longer had to travel on the back of the wyvern. And that is how we have reached the general level units, beings that can communicate without any issues, and were for a long time the highest rank the main character's shadows could achieve. One such shadow was Kargalgan, who belonged to the High Orcs. As a shadow, he gained the name Tusk, and as a servant of the King of the Dead, he possessed perhaps the most diverse set of abilities. As a shaman, he perfectly combined defensive and offensive attacks, as he could not only buff himself and his allies, but during battle he could also use gravity-based magic, petrify, blind, control fire attacks, and curses. Furthermore, as a general, he commanded the mages and received an item that doubled his magical damage, making Tusk one of the main offensive forces of the Shadow Legions, sharing a closer bond with his master. The same cannot be said for Greed, because in life he was Sung's enemy, threatening his loved ones as the S-class hunter Hong Dong-su. So as part of his punishment as a shadow, he was initially forced into a subservient posture for his redemption, which made him significantly more humble than the rest of the generals. When it comes to strength, it's hard to find any special distinction in his case, other than the fact that as an S-class hunter, he immediately promoted to the rank of general. But in my opinion, he should be weaker than the previously mentioned Kargalgan. Besides, both he and Iron do not stay with the main character forever, because after the time regression, they leave the Shadow Monarch's army and live as humans in the new timeline. Therefore, next it's time to talk about Igris, who in terms of strength can arguably be placed in third place without question. This is additionally interesting because he definitely went through the longest path of development, from A rank all the way to S rank and becoming a marshal. And back when Sung faced Igris as a boss related to the class change quest, he admitted himself that his survival in that clash was pure luck. Luck he wouldn't have had if Igris hadn't fought with his sword until the end, instead of an honorable fist fight, making this duel one of the most dangerous encounters the main character ever experienced. Nonetheless, after he managed to enlist Igris into his soldiers, he became incredibly loyal to him, often bowing to his master or bringing him trophies. In all of this, it also turns out that the Magnificent Knight once belonged to the entourage of the previous Shadow Monarch, Ashborn, and his task was to test his successor, in this case, Sung. Although I'm not entirely sure here, it seems his power was somehow sealed since then, which is why he only promoted from the rank of Elite Knight to Marshal once the protagonist became the true Shadow Monarch and became one with Ashborn. Still, for most of the story, he was superseded by Beru, who towered over him. As I mentioned at the beginning of the material, Beru was originally the Ant King, whose sole purpose was combat. This doesn't completely change though, because even as an undead insect, he still loves to fight, but at Sung's command, he can make compromises, as he showed during a sparring match when he tried to psychologically dominate his female opponent. But it wasn't entirely safe, because when Beru was stabbed in the back, he flew into a rage, and Sung had to intervene so he wouldn't hurt his future wife. But aside from his explosive and battle-driven side, Beru grew fond of watching historical Korean dramas and showed a close relationship with the Shadow Monarch, addressing him with exceptional respect as king, looking after his family, and placing absolute trust in him. When it comes to strength, the earlier Ant King, even as a general, outclassed most S-class hunters, including even the best one from all of Japan, and with the rank of Marshal, he became even more powerful. Also, regarding the number of skills, the earlier Ant King is quite versatile, as not only can he fly using his wings, but he can also use a paralyzing poison, which I suspect, at the stage of the fight on Jeju Island, could have brought Sung to the brink of death if not for his status immunity. But that's still not the end of Beru's capabilities, because he can heal targets even from a near-death state, and he's also able to absorb the knowledge and skills of the enemies he devours. And at the very end, we have Grand Marshal Bellion, the second strongest and simultaneously most important commander after the main character, originally being a servant of Ashborn, born from the fruit of the World Tree eons ago, commanding his legions in what is now a ruined army. Although simply surviving such a massive clash that his original master got involved in only testifies to his power. Although his skills are mainly physical capabilities and weapon handling, even under the command of the new monarch, Sung, he showed that he can easily defeat Beru. And that is unfortunately all for today. Please let me know which of Sung's soldiers is your favorite, because mine is undoubtedly Beru. So until the next episode, dear viewers,